Hello, everyone. I am Angie You, a board member of ElevAAte Biotech and CEO of Architect Therapeutics. I am so honored and excited today to be speaking with Vicki Sato, who has been one of my role models and frankly heroes since I first learned her name 25 years ago. Vicki was a Harvard professor in biochemistry, then became an entrepreneur and was one of biotech's pioneering leaders as a scientist who helped Biogen and Vertex. She also became a Harvard Business School professor and worked under President Biden, and has served on boards like BMS and Alnylam, amongst many other boards. And I'm just really excited to hear her story and her journey as a Japanese American and one of the OGs of incredible female Asian leaders in the biotech industry. So with that, I'd love to welcome Dr. Vicki Sato. Hi, Vicki.
Thank you, Angie and Elaine. And thank all of you that are in the audience. I'm really humbled and privileged to be able to join this group today. I've been learning about ElevAAte, a terrific group, and I'm hoping that the session today can be more of a conversation and less of a lecture
Yeah.
or pitch.
Yeah, and I told Vicki, so the first time I ever got to speak to Vicki was in preparation for this, and I will admit I've been a fangirl of Vicki literally for 25 years. I learned about her when I read The Billion-Dollar Molecule when I was in graduate school, and it was a story about Vertex. And the only names I remembered from that book was my advisor, PhD advisor, Stuart Schreiber, because he was an early collaborator and competitor of Vertex, the CEO of Vertex, Josh Boger, and Vicki Sato. And what's interesting to me is I reread The Billion-Dollar Molecule in preparation for this fireside chat. And like, I thought Vicki was the main character of the book, that first book. And she was only mentioned in the
Yeah, like
last
2 pages.
chapter, right? But in my mind, there was something, it was so powerful for me to hear about this badass female Asian leader in two of like the kind of pioneering biotechs in Boston that that just stuck with me. And I think that book alone really inspired me to want to go into startup biotech. And I think, Vicki, you probably just don't realize that your leadership and your success for so many of us, way beyond me, has had such an impact. So it really is an honor. I am very humbled to be able to talk to you. And I I know you've talked about your childhood and your growing up in the Luke Timmerman podcast, The Long Run, and I'd recommend everyone to listen to that. But I do think it's worth talking a little bit about your family, your grandparents who came to this country, and your parents, and what happened to your family, especially in a time today when immigrants are being targeted and in many ways villainized. Just it's important to remember history. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that and how you ended up in Chicago and growing up there.
Happy to, Angie. And I will say that I've been hearing about you for years from people like Christina Burrow, and I keep thinking someday I'm going to meet her. And here we are. So my background is not unlike the backgrounds of I would guess a lot of you in the audience. My grandparents emigrated from Japan to the west coast of the United States and settled on the west coast. My mother's side of the family in Oregon and my father's in California, and they were there making a living for themselves first as farmers and then moving up to be independent small business people, if you will. They had grocery stores and dry cleaners and but it was early on in that time, because my grandparents emigrated at the turn of the last century, that and they were really believers in the American way, and my parents' generation were all American-born citizens, a concept that I hope we don't lose. But the war came, and just as they had reached a point of their families had reached a point of having some economic independence and the first step of that American dream, the war came, and because of the war with Japan and Pearl Harbor, the Roosevelt administration decided that Japanese Americans, especially on the West Coast, Japanese and Japanese Americans on the West Coast were a political threat to the safety of the United States. So there was an executive order that that mandated that all people of Japanese ancestry, including American-born citizens, would be relocated 300 miles inland and interned and held in camps. And so my dad was a sophomore at Berkeley. He'd worked really, really hard, and as did his family to get him to college. And he was pre-med, and my mom, they weren't married. My mom had to graduate from high school early for the privilege of going into the camp. So the next several years were really a challenge for them. And I think that shaped it shaped their generation for sure, and it shaped my generation, the Sansei generation of Japanese Americans, a lot as well, because theirs was a generation that deferred their dreams for sure.
Mhm.
And so as we all experience those ambitions, those dreams, those aspirations become a responsibility of the next generation. Chicago was an interesting thing. So, well, how'd you get to Chicago with all this West Coast stuff? But in Chicago, the government put an office called the War Relocation Authority. And this government agency was responsible um, for finding secured, I'm trying to find the right, for finding jobs, employment for the Japanese Americans and the Japanese who were interned. So if you wanted to get out of the camps before the camps closed, you could not get out unless this agency placed you in a job. And then when the war was finally over and the camps opened, this agency had built some infrastructure in Chicago for finding jobs. So my mother and her sisters came out of the camps before the end of the war as domestics, as nannies and housekeepers. My dad, um, my dad, who was angrier, stayed in the camps till the war was over and came out as a farmhand to the farms in New Jersey. So that's why Chicago, and that's why Chicago to this day is actually a very vibrant Japanese American community.
So did you grow up with many Japanese or Asians around you?
No.
Mhm.
My mom was quite active in one of the Chicago Buddhist churches,
Mhm.
but I went to a public school that was not did not have a lot of Asian representation. It was a very white community. And so no, I didn't, my Japanese community, which was extremely important to me, was my extended family. So my aunts and uncles, we all lived. I mean, it's kind of, I don't, in thinking about this, we all lived within a block of each other. And we celebrated all of our birthdays together and anniversaries. And, just we celebrated everything together, kept the Japanese culture going. But it was really a family culture. I was not terribly active in the broader Japanese American community.
So basically, pretty much most of your life, you've been that rare Asian, rare female Asian in your community or wherever or companies, it sounds like.
My most um, Asian demographic experience actually was when I postdoced in the Bay Area, and that was, I have to say, it was an eye-opening experience for a lot of unexpected reasons. But until then, all through grade school, high school, college, grad school, it was a very minority-driven experience.
Yeah. And when did you discover your love of science? It sounds like you really benefited from the great public schools in Chicago, but when was that light turned on for you?
Well, the light the light flickered on and off. Um, as I think it does for all of us. So I benefited, I think you and I talked about this. I benefited from the fact that because of Sputnik going up in the 1950s, the federal government suddenly worried prophetically that we were losing the science race to the Russians. And so there was a very big federal policy to enhance science education in the public schools, particularly in the secondary schools. So I was a beneficiary of that, and I got to take terrific hands-on, experimentally driven science classes, which was a big change from what happened before, what came before, which was read this textbook and memorize these things. And so science just was an exciting classroom, and everybody in the classroom, and science is often an elective as well, was excited to be there. So I think that the school stimulus was an important one. And the other was the family belief that being a doctor was important, because being a doctor was an economically um, more favorable situation, and also a respected position in the community. And that if you were a doctor, people couldn't be arbitrary about whether you were qualified. They could be arbitrary about whether they wanted to come to you, but they couldn't be arbitrary about the fact that you had qualifications. So being a doctor was on the very short list of things
I
things
think
I
many of
really
us
started
share
to believe.
that family, that family pressure and
And
concept of
so,
being a
so there was
doctor.
that. And then, a neighbor of my aunt's was, I think he must have been one of the first Nisei to actually be a scientist. And he worked in what we in a lab. He worked not in an academic lab, but he worked in like a quality control testing lab. And he loved what he did. And I don't know, he just, whenever we saw him, he took me to his lab once just to, to see what it was like. And it was just, it was fun. It was fun. And I liked looking at bugs under microscopes, all that stuff.
Now, I know your mom, you said your mom's education was cut short. And you ended up, you're the first in your generation to go to college, and you ended up at Radcliffe.
As it then was.
Obviously an incredible feat at that time. Was it, I know it was culture shock, frankly, for me, even though I'd never grown up with many Asians wherever I lived, but it was culture shock for me to go to Harvard.
Where
There
did
was
you
that.
grow up?
I grew up in upstate New York and then
Mhm.
Florida, and I was always like one of two Asians in my school. But there was something about the going to Harvard, I felt very much, even though there were other Asians, I felt there were all these kids from prep school and I felt very different. And I'm curious what your experience was going to Radcliffe. I can't imagine there are many Asians there at all.
Now, if you felt out of place when you were there, I mean, there were two out of a class of 100 and some, there were two of us at Radcliffe, women, because it was an all-women school at the time, that were Asian. She
Wow.
was Chinese American, I was Japanese American. The Harvard class, which was 1,200 people, maybe had 10. Not that I could name them. So it was, it was, um, yes, we were in a sea
All
of,
right.
a sea of,
And
pretty much a sea of whiteness. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, you've always grown up with that. And, you said something to me striking, and I do believe we're oftentimes so influenced by our parents that your mom, you know, was always one who said, you just make do, you figure it out and you just make do with what the circumstances, right? And your family clearly had to do that with the Japanese internment, everything, all their belongings and possessions taken away from them. And I do wonder, I mean, you were always kind of the first. Um, but when I talk to you, it just seems like it didn't really seem to phase you, or maybe you were used to it, or I'm curious how you got through that being the only or the other.
Um, I don't, maybe it's what attracted me to entrepreneurship. I don't know. Um, I didn't make it wasn't a big thing. It just wasn't a big thing. My parents, my dad grew up in a very Asian small town in California. My mom grew up in Portland, Oregon, and so they had very different growing up experiences. Um, Mom was always very clear about the fact that one had to function in the world in which one had to function, and you did what you had to do. But and when I was young and idealistic, I didn't want to believe her, but she always used to say to me, look, you look different. And don't kid yourself that other people don't first see that you look different. So you're going to have to act in a way that makes them feel not threatened, and you're going to have to act in a way that makes it clear that you're competent.
That is so interesting. So let's walk through. I mean, you went to Radcliffe, you did your PhD in biochemistry at Harvard, as did I. And then you went to the West Coast, I guess for your postdoc.
You'll notice that I did not go to medical school.
Right, you didn't. So yeah, what happened there?
Well, at some point I thought, I just couldn't take it I mean, I was so ill prepared to be at Radcliffe, Harvard academically that, I was just became, um, I didn't become enough of a grind, but I was a grind. And when I got to the point, and then I started working in a lab, my senior year, I started working in a research lab. And I just thought, I cannot see myself spending another 4 years with the same people in the same classrooms, grubbing for the same grades. And I really like the freedom of the lab. So I'm going to apply to grad school. My parents didn't understand that I mean, it was, I think 20 years before they really understood what happened, but I was cool with it.
And then I heard how you became a Harvard professor is you applied through a science ad. Is that right? That there's an ad for being a professor at Harvard and somehow you got the professorship?
Well, it was very much an assistant professorship, but I did answer an ad in science. They were looking for an assistant professor. I really liked the department that I was in, and I was 4 years in California in the Bay Area doing postdocs, during which I changed fields actually from plant sciences and biophysics to immunology. And I wanted to get back to the East Coast. I decided I was an East Coast neurotic, not a West Coast neurotic, and so I wanted to get back. And so I was looking for jobs, academic jobs on the East Coast, because those were the only kind of jobs you did when you were a PhD in the life sciences. And that was an ad. So I just figured I had nothing to lose. I'm sure I wouldn't even get a call back, but if I didn't send the resume in, I was definitely not going to get a call back. So I sent the resume in.
That's one of the things I've learned is I always go through my head, there's always no downside to trying or asking, right? And that's something my parents never taught me because they were very much like, put your head down, don't ask for things. So that's been a big learning for me. When I was in grad school at Harvard, it was still a time when being an academic, no less an academic at Harvard, was kind of the upper echelon, the most noble thing to do. And industry and business was kind of they literally called it the dark side so I'm curious, you had achieved being an assistant professor at Harvard. What led you to entrepreneurship? And I know you didn't immediately go to Biogen, but you actually started a diagnostic company. And again, I mean, at that time, it's only recently, I know MIT did a study in 2010, I think, that showed only 10% of the female professors were founders of companies, despite the many companies that are spun out of MIT. And yet you at that time, you were starting a company. I'm just curious how that happened and what led you to that.
Well, I certainly didn't start it alone, but it, when I took, when I took the job at Harvard, to which I answered the ad in science, my colleagues at Stanford all said to me, big mistake, big mistake. Um, Junior faculty, Harvard, you'll never get tenure. Nobody will pay attention to you. You won't get any students. You won't meet at the senior faculty will just take advantage of you, make you teach dumb classes. And it's just, don't go there. It's a big mistake. So I went there, and some of it was true, but most of it wasn't. I had there were like 6 or 7 of us in the junior faculty class. Um, and I had great students that really helped me set up the lab, and senior faculty did talk to me, and I had a couple of not so great experiences, but by and large, it was a really good decision that I came to Harvard. However, the truism that you're not going to get tenure was a truism. There was one woman who was tenured in all of the life sciences, Ruth Hubbard Wald, who had been George Wald's research assistant, a well-trodden path for women in science. And so she had just gotten tenure, but there were no other women. And I wasn't gonna, I was self-aware enough to know that I wasn't gonna be the first. And that's kind of freeing, actually. It's kind of freeing. So my lab was chugging along. I had senior faculty who were really encouraging me to do stuff, um and I was teaching a class I really liked, and I was teaching the class with Wally Gilbert. And while Wally and I were teaching, um he won the Nobel Prize for DNA sequencing. And so that was cool, right? That was like, whoa, I actually know somebody. And but then a couple years after that, he got involved starting Biogen. And I would tell the story that Wally's an amazing lecturer. I learned more immunology listening to his lectures than, that I'd learned during my entire postdoc. And he was always there. He was always there to lecture. He graded term papers just like I did. He showed up in section just like I did. And then
Amazing.
all of a sudden, I started getting these calls. Can you give a lecture tomorrow? I've got to be in London to raise $10 million from, some company I'd never heard of. And so I watched him starting Biogen with other Biogen co-founders, and I watched Mark Potashny and Tom Aniatis start Genetics Institute, a proud name in the history of biotechnology. And so um, there were people around me whose science I really respected and who I respected as individuals, sort of playing around with this industry thing, which, as you exactly point out, was not something you did. It was a sellout. It was an admission that you were a gamma player, not an alpha player. And so you just didn't do that. Um, but I knew I wasn't going to get I mean, I knew I wasn't going to get tenure. So I was looking for tenure jobs at other places. But I like being in Boston. And I had a sabbatical coming, and I had a chance to get involved with some colleagues at MIT who were starting this diagnostic company. So I took the sabbatical and helped start this diagnostic company, which was a blast. I met my first, intellectual property lawyer. I met my first venture capitalist. It was a trip. And I liked it much more than I wanted to admit.
Oh,
And so I decided to, instead of continuing to interview for faculty positions in other places, I decided to throw my hat in and be the one person of the founding group who actually worked full time at the company. And and there was pushback, and the calculus that I made was, look, I probably have a couple years to do this to find out if I liked it and if I was any good at it. And if I decided to come back to academia, I'd probably have to get a lateral position. Right. It was not a risk without a cost.
right.
But I decided, you know, what the hell? And it was terrific. Right from, finding lab space to renovating the labs to getting a call at
Right.
midnight that the fire alarms are going off to just all that stuff. And also finding out that really good science is not enough to make a company.
Mhm.
You
So
actually have to think about the market.
what happened? How long did you do that and what happened to that company?
So I was there as head of research for, I don't know, maybe 3 years. I can't remember.
Mhm.
We pushed along the science, we got to field trials, we had a prototype product, all that stuff. And then we hired our first marketing person who said, have you actually looked at the economics of this marketplace? And we went, oh, gee, but it works, but it works. Isn't that enough? Um, and so, so that was all very interesting, painful, more painful than I'm telling it. But I also discovered that, as interesting as diagnostics was, I really wanted to do drugs. That therapeutic intervention was more where my scientific heart lay as an immunologist. And then a position opened up at Biogen. And I'd always wanted to be there because I felt like I'd been, present at the birthing, as it was formed. And it was Genentech, there was Cetus, Genentech, and Biogen really.
And
And
wasn't it Wally Gilbert who recruited you to
so
Biogen?
Wally persuaded me not to be scared, if you will, about trying. But it was like, yep, I can't. You should just, if you're interested, come on in, get an interview, talk to the people. Richard Flavelle was head of research. He had left wherever he was. He left England to come and work full time as the CSO at Biogen, which was pretty unheard of. And Bob Kamen had left wherever he was to be the head of research at Genetics Institute. So that first generation of academics who left their day jobs to have a different day job was now in place. So it wasn't quite as scary, and there were some cool role models.
Mhm.
So I went and interviewed.
So, Vicky, being the longtime fangirl of you as I have been, anytime I knew of anyone who had interactions with you, whether they had interactions with you because you were on a board, they were an executive on, the consistent thing I've heard about you is basically that you just like you're crazy smart, you command respect, you focus on the right things. Like you clearly have this concept of executive presence. And it's something we at the board of ElevAAte talk a lot about because it's something that either Asians struggle with, maybe it's our culture and or it's code word implicit bias in which people say, oh, this person doesn't have executive presence. What surprised me in our prep was you telling me some feedback you got from, it sounds like you had incredible mentors who
Mm.
were willing to just give you some hard feedback when you were younger and growing in your career. And I'd love for you to share some of that feedback they gave you and the kind of the thought process in your own journey as you developed your own sense of self and your leadership style.
I did have great mentors, and I think great mentors are people who illustrate what's possible and illustrate what's exciting to you individually, but they're also people who hold up a mirror and say pretty frankly, you know, A and B are actually really great mentors don't even say A and B are good. They just go to C sucks and you better do something about it. And it started when I was a grad student. I had a PhD advisor who had grown up in Los Angeles. And so he'd grown up he was familiar with the Japanese American culture and the community. And he pulled me aside as I was getting ready to do my first, presentation at a cell biology meeting. And he said, look, he said, you're pretty smart. You work hard, but if you keep acting like a self-effacing Japanese woman, nobody's going to listen to you. And I was like, whoa, what does that even mean? It's like,
Yeah.
you're timid, you start every conversation you have with me with, I'm sorry, but, or, I know it's not very good, but, and I really wasn't conscious of that until he pointed it out to me. And I was like, and and that was the first really explicit wake-up call. And I thank him to this, I've always thanked him for the courage to say things that today we might think are unsayable,
Yeah.
right? He didn't say you should be a better XY. He said, you have these cultural traits, not in so many words. He said to me, you have these cultural traits and they're not helping you if they're not helping you succeed.
Yeah, I mean, he gave you very specific examples of what you were doing
Right.
that maybe you didn't even realize.
So I rehearsed that talk a lot and got rid of all the I'm sorry's, but and then I kept getting that feedback. My postdoc advisor said the same thing to me. Like, you're not really gonna make it if you keep sitting at the back of the room. Um, or if you're not forcing yourself to tackle harder problems, or what, if you're gonna be a follower, but if you want to be a leader, you got to take some risk and you've got to convince other people to take risk with you. That was an interesting one. Um, and then when I was at Harvard, I was giving the first ever talk. The biology department at that time had started public lectures to the public on topics of science. And I got picked to be the first junior faculty woman to give such a talk, as opposed to, a Nobel laureate or whatever. And I worked really hard on it. Students in my lab did all the slides for me. And I was rehearsing it in the lecture hall in the biolabs, which you probably know. And while he just ripped it to shreds, he said, you know, it's too detailed. You're in the weeds. What do you want people to take away from this? Why are you, it's not convincing. Go figure it out. Do it again. And other people read my papers that I wrote and said, you're not clear about this. Stand up for if you believe in your data, make me believe your data. If you're going to qualify every piece of data you have, I'm not going to believe your data. And it was that kind of stand, if you did it and if you did it well and you believe in it, don't keep apologizing for it. So there were a lot of dark nights, a lot of dark nights, lots of alcohol consumed with colleagues and fellow postdocs and so forth about what am I supposed to do with this? Do I want to do anything with it? This is a challenge for who I am as a human being, for my family, for my culture. What am I going to do with this? Um,
Yeah.
so anyway, but
So then, I mean, on one hand, my observation is you had a lot of people who actually really cared about you. I always say if people are giving you that feedback, they obviously believe in you and they care about you, that they want to push you, right? But there was something in you, while it might have been hard, you took it to heart. And, I think you talked about it very much as a scientist. You play as you thought about your identity but also your ambitions, you started doing experiments. And I'd love for you to just speak about that.
well, it's one thing to get the feedback. It's another thing to decide you are going to try to see if the feedback is correct, right? And if you make a change, whether it makes a difference in the outcome. So yeah, I'm an empiricist I guess, by DNA. And so I did start to, I needed to learn how to make myself comfortable being assertive. And it started by being assertive with data, because data is neutral, and as someone also said to me, people, as scientists, we're always saying, oh, the data will speak for itself. And someone said to me, the data rarely speaks for itself. You actually have to get up there and speak for it. And so that was a good place to try and not be apologetic, not to qualify. Of course, you haven't done every experiment.
Right.
Of course, there are things to do. That can all be put in a context that's correct. And that doesn't have to diminish what you believe to be the impact of the work that you've just done. And other people are absolutely free to criticize it. And so you better be prepared you know, to think through that feedback and come back. So it started with, let's try this out on the science. And then when I was at Biogen and started rising through the management ranks, it became much more of a priority to try it out in management situations, because I was the only woman in a 13 member executive team.
Yeah, you mentioned to me that the white male CEO of Biogen would just push you, like telling you to take management courses, giving you books to read. Again, he clearly believed in you and cared about you, but was pushing you.
No, it's very true. I owe Jim a lot. He was the CEO that really turned Biogen around, led to the launch of Avonex, but he really, it was gruesome and grueling to be part of a team to turn this really proud pioneering company that had fallen on hard times because of doing too many projects, all this stuff, too many projects, not enough resources, not being realistic about your competitive position. And so really learning the business principles to get the company to be viable, because the stock's at 2, people are leaving, you're laying people off, it's not fun. We kept expecting sharing plow to buy us for the alpha interferon royalties, but life was not so easy. And Jim was like, no, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. It's going to be hard. And you got to run the science. So you better make some good picks. So it was just, it's through the crucible of hard times, to be trite. You learn a lot and you figure out, and it's exciting. So if you're excited about it, then you
Right.
do it. If you feel weighted down by it, then you don't do it.
Right,
So
right. And you had said Biogen was the place where you really grew up and learned to be the professional. And Vertex was when you moved to Vertex, that's where you really played it all out in terms of being a leader. Can you speak a little bit about because you joined Vertex at a critical moment, and you joined as head of R&D and ultimately became the president. So kind of talk, talk about your leadership there, how you developed your own sense of style, what you thought was important for developing a good culture.
um, tough. I mean, I've been very lucky to have worked at 2 companies that have have had a tremendous impact in terms of making medicines that make a difference. and also companies, the experience of building the company, or in Biogen's case, sort of helping to reshape a company. So it was putting out exciting medicines because the science was hard but worth doing, but also at the same time figuring out how to build a company. And at Biogen, the CEO was an experienced leader. He had made Abbott Diagnostics into to this day, behemoth that was an industry leader. And he'd been at Texas Instruments before that. So he was all about the business and not about the science. Vertex, Josh was an incredible, is still an incredible scientist, had recruited a team of unbelievable scientists, all of them 10 times smarter than I was. And you talk about the billion-dollar molecule. When I signed my employment contract, he sent me the galley proofs of the book and said, here, these people all report to you now. You should read this book. And it was, really talented people, really, really smart, really, really driven. And Josh had handpicked every single one of these people. And I learned a lot from Vertex about that, about what it takes to build a company from the ground up. And culture starts and ends with every single hire. Josh and I interviewed everybody until the company was close to 300 people.
Wow. Wow.
I walked into a situation where every candidate um, was Biogen didn't do email. Jim would scribble you what we used to call Jimmy Graham, saying good job or do it again or whatever. But Vertex was really into email. And so every candidate, the minute you were finished interviewing the candidate, you would circulate to the other interviewees what you thought and what they should probe, because you didn't have time to probe it, right? And then if they made it through the day, then either Josh or I would see them, or sometimes both if that was the way it was. But I learned from that every person you hire makes a difference. And you cannot not do that. So I'm kind of a fanatic about when companies are forming and well into their adolescence. Interview as many people as you can. Make sure that people not in the chain of command for that hire get to meet them. So the marketing people actually can tell you if the chemist made any sense, and vice versa. Um, I, I I learned at Vertex the really refined art of building a company for sustainability, because it was never about, we'll just do this project and then we'll sell it to somebody. It was adamantly, we're going to take on Merck, we're going to take on Pfizer. Screw these
Right.
guys, they're not that smart. And yes, it was arrogant. Yes, it was aggressive, but I'll tell you, it was backed up by such a commitment to a culture of excellence and competitiveness and um, and support. I mean, we yelled at each other a lot, but it was such a cohesive group of people really committed to what Josh was really committed to building.
And well, what do you think people would say was your leadership style?
Um, it's you always have to ask other people, because you can think you're being collaborative and open and all this stuff, and then you find out that people really think you're the Wicked Witch of the West. But I like to think, that being fact-based and data-driven, which comes from the science side, is an important part of this. Um, Making sure that people are heard and that you collect opinions from not just the expected corners, like don't just ask the biologist about the biology, ask some other people about the biology, is really important. And then it's also really important to drive to a decision,
Yeah.
because once again, you can carry on the analytical conversation for a long time. And in those days, Vertex was often criticized as if we were guilty of, paralysis by analysis. And so developing the skill of knowing when to cut to the chase
Yeah. Yeah.
was an important thing to learn. That and not avoiding conflict.
I'm such a believer in that. I have also heard in all my diligence around you throughout the years, look, you're tough as nails, you don't suffer fools, but you're also clearly a compassionate leader. And I'm just going to share what someone just posted on LinkedIn, a little blurb about you. And it's someone named Ann Kwong, who I don't know, but There was a time earlier in my career at Vertex when I had to handle a crisis in my family, and I felt like I was breaking in half and drowning in my grief and fear. Vicki Sato was my supervisor at the time, and she gave me the space and support to work as much as I could while taking the time I needed to deal with my crisis and to grieve. Eventually, the crisis resolved, and I was able to work with my lab and other scientists to create telaprevir, Vertex's first billion-dollar drug that helped to cure patients with HCV. I will always be grateful to Vicki for her support, and for this and many other reasons. She is the best leader I have ever worked with in the industry. That says a lot, right?
Well, Anne is a remarkable scientist. We recruited her thanks to my colleagues at Vertex. They came back from a meeting. We'd been battling Hep C as a project for years, and they said, "We just heard this woman who's running the Shearing Plow program. She's amazing. We have to hire her." And so I said, well, okay, like, bring her in. We don't have any money to hire her right now, but you know what, the hell, figure it out. And they brought Anne in, and she was amazing. She was the missing piece. We had great chemistry, great computational chemistry, all this stuff. We needed somebody who really understood the virology and who could pull the problem together and who could innovate like crazy in terms of assays that mattered. And Anne was that person. And so, I think there's an old saying that I learned from Jim Vincent, which is about prima donnas. And Anne was never a prima donna. Anne was just a very, very special scientist. And she worked like crazy. So, hey, if she wanted to work on Sundays at midnight, but needed to take time for herself, during why not? Right? Why not? And we all have lives to lead. And if we aren't given space to feel like we can live those lives, then you don't feel like you belong to a community that cares about you. So why bust your ass?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Just reading the billion-dollar molecule, you could tell that environment was very intense. That's kind of what drew me, that I thought that was so exciting, but I could see also it could be in difficult times, tough too. So it sounds like you created the right environment for her to thrive and to ultimately create value for the company. We have an audience member, Dan, who has a question. And his question is, what's your thought process to decide whether this is the battle to fight for?
Um, always a question worth asking yourself. I think for me, there are always two components. One, is it a principle, whether it's a scientific principle or a business principle or whatever, moral principle? Is this something I want to stick my neck out for? Is this something that I want to stand up and be counted for? And do I really want to push hard up to and including saying, no, 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 we can't kill this project yet. We have to do it. Or no, we have to kill this project. So is it something you feel passionately about and have studied hard enough, that you've done your homework enough to say, yes, I believe in this. I'm gonna I'm gonna pick this battle. I'm gonna take a stand. Um, and the other question, which I think is equally important, is does my taking a stand matter? In other words, can I bring a solution? Do I have any solutions to this problem? Or
Right,
am I just saying, yeah, go for it? Because if I don't have a solution for the problem, or at least one of a possible set of plausible solutions, then what am I? I'm not fighting with anything. I may be fighting for something, but I have no weapons.
right,
So, I think this part of picking your spots and knowing what matters, but also being realistic about whether you have the tools to
right.
do something about it has always been an important consideration.
And you let being a leader in two massive organizations, you've seen so many young Asians through the ranks because there's so many Asians, especially at the junior levels, at the scientist level. What do you see in terms of things that might hold them back, and what advice have you given some of them?
Um, s- so I've recognized I've worked with a lot of Asians. I've seen a lot of not a lot. I've seen the contributions that they make, and a great example in the leadership that they espouse. I think even my younger self that we talked about, there can be, I don't think it's a timidity. I think we're brought up, most Asian cultures are extremely respectful
Yeah.
of seniors, whether they're authority seniors or age seniors or whatever. And that very deep respect, which I value tremendously as in the culture, can sometimes be read as not being feisty enough, not taking it on. And I think we have to ask ourselves, respect is fundamental. I don't want to work any place where respect isn't deep and where dignity isn't a high value cultural attribute. But we also have to say, is there a way that we can disagree here and that I can make a point without being disrespectful? I must say, as a talent that I think we are losing as a nation, which is pretty sad. But I think sometimes um, that cultural tenet about respect
Yeah.
is can hold us back from saying, hey, I get it. I get what you're saying, but have you thought about it like this? Or actually, I've been doing this experiment on the side here, and I just really want to show you some data. And I hear what you're saying, but I just, I just want to do this, or I want to call you on this. It need not be disrespectful, but I think sometimes we edit ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever pulled Asians aside the way some of your mentors had and said, look, you gotta, if you wanna make it.
Um, I've had I've had really talented Asian people working who just asked me, why am I stuck here in middle management, right? What should I do? And so, it's like, let's go out and have a beer. And if you do you really want to talk about this, or do you really want me to just say something that'll make you feel good?
Yeah.
And um and so I've had really thoughtful conversations. I've had really thoughtful conversations with young Harvard undergraduates who I used to tutor when I was being a tutor when I was at Vertex, but doing a pay it forward at Harvard in the biochemistry department where you probably were. Um, so yes, I've also had conversations with HR directors about the fact that um, we could be doing more in many ways, not just for Asians. We could be doing more to actually address where cultural traditions which need to be respected and which are valuable can sometimes get in the way of what good old American business practices value and reward. And the system's not perfect, right? It's very uncomfortable to have those discussions. It's very easy to F it up. Um, but I think it's an important part of creating cultures where people feel always respected, always dignified, um, but also able to come to grips with things that are standing in the way of their own advancement if they want to advance.
Yeah, yeah. There's probably quite a number of young women here who I've pulled aside and said something very similar, like, look, you can't be that quiet Asian woman in the room. You're gonna end up doing all the work and you're never gonna get promoted, right? Like no one's ever gonna see you in that leadership position, and you've got to come out of your shell and you've got to practice speaking up. I do think that's especially for Asian women, but you and I talked as well as Asian men. It's an important factor that can hold us back. And it's something we talk a lot about at ElevAAte, and we have leadership training specifically to address that. But you still have to keep to your authentic, like if you're a quieter introverted person, you're not going to fundamentally change, right? So you have to find your own style. And it sounds like you got a lot of that by just it's shocking to me hear the advice you got a long time ago based on everything I've heard about you as a professional, but you've clearly, found your own way to be yourself, but also be remarkably successful and such a great leader.
But I think as you know, as individuals, and I'm sure you face this as well, I'm sure everybody in the audience has as well, is this is it really a trait, am I being asked to give up something that's important to me? Are they really that much in conflict, or are we asking the question in the wrong way? Because I think most of us want to be effective. That's why we work hard and are doing things. And if there are things that are keeping us from being effective, then we have to ask for ourselves, what's the right poise?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Alvin has a question in the chat. He said, Vicki, so grateful for your story. Do you feel it is important for East Asians in our industry to preferentially support or help each other? And what message or advice would you say to individuals who might be reticent to visibly support other East Asians in our industry?
Well, that is a really good question. We've talked about some of this. I think it is important for us to support each other. And the lessons we learned as individuals and the actions we take as individuals are not necessarily the right for everybody, right? It's not about that. But I think it's really important. It was really important for individuals at every stage of their career to feel like they have a community that they can talk to about this and feel safe, which is a trite thing to say, but we all know what that you want to feel like you're having an honest conversation and that you're not, people are looking at the facts as you see them and as they lay on the ground. Um, I this issue of tribalness is a complicated one, and I don't have, and I get it. The only time that I ever had overt in my face, I will not rent this apartment to you, but because of what you look like, was in California. And that's because there were so many more Asians there than there were in my little community in Chicago. And it took me a while to figure out what had happened. So people hanging out together can be scary. And we're seeing some of that play out in these times. But I think it's really important. I think it's really important um, for us to have a sense of strong community and of community support. And it also can't be artificial.
Yeah, I
It just,
agree. It has to be an
it
authentic.
can't be artificial.
Yeah, I
So,
totally agree. This
hang
is,
out with who you want to hang out with,
yeah,
let the chips fall where they may, and just be, um, just be committed to it, be committed to it, be committed to what you're doing.
this is very much the ethos of, and the genesis of ElevAAte, really, is exactly that. Um, I want to move on to, I mean, you've done so many things in your career. We talked about what fills your cup lately, and you spent some time being one of two representatives of the biotech pharma industry on President Biden's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology, and how you then got into policy. And I think it's a worthwhile discussion today, especially as we've got threats to NIH funding, threats to immigrant scientists, your perspective as to what's happening today, um, and what you think we need to do about it.
Well, I wish I had a prescription for what to do about it. I don't. I am very concerned about what's happening today. One of the things um, PCAS, the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology, really worked on over the 4 years under the Biden administration. And this isn't a political statement, it was just something that was important to that administration and important to us as scientists across the gamut of science, was American competitiveness. Of, this in life sciences, particularly this country has led in life sciences in a really unchallenged way since the Second World War, when Vannevar Bush wrote his, Frontiers of Science speech. And federal support for science is what's enabled plastics, the internet, medicines, whatever. This innovation doesn't happen without support at a level that can really only be created at a government, at a national level, I think. And and that's one of the things I really think I thought, I think I learned in some economics class, but really realized sitting in staterooms talking about issues of policy, which is, these policies are important. As a nation, we've never really had a national science policy. We've had various policies,
Mhm.
um, but that is under more threat now than I think I've ever seen it. There have been battles fought. Reagan didn't believe in HIV,
Right.
um, whatever. But um, this is a much more systematic dismembering of the trust between science and the public.
I,
And
I,
once that goes away, then um, what does science do, right? I mean, if you become the Wicked Witch of the West, then the lens through which the people you're trying to impact economically, societally, whatever, will view everything through the lens of the Wicked Witch of the West. So reestablishing um, more effective communication between the general public and science,
Yeah,
having national policies that communicate effectively about what science can do and what it can't do. And we need to be honest about that too. Are we oversimplifying the science? Are we making promises we can't deliver on? So I just think I think that's really a threat right now, and I'm particularly discouraged because young people look at science and say, I thought I wanted to do science. I'm excited about science, but I don't know whether I want a career there, right? Academic labs aren't getting grants, companies aren't getting
right.
funded. There and that's when we need the next generation's brains most, is how do we work ourselves? How do we create a different kind of success story here? And how do we do it without punishing people? How do we do it without um, sending people into intellectual internment camps, if you will? It's just, an important time to be thoughtful and visible.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe on a more positive note, I know Leanne has a question as what is the most interesting to you in terms of the next wave of biotech? What is getting you excited? I know you're on so many boards
I'm not
and
on so many. I'm a good board member.
no, that I know, I've heard.
Um, um, I don't, well, I guess, we've been through, I grew up in a phase where drug discovery got redefined from physiologic assays to very target-driven reductionist molecular assays. And, it's HMG-CoA reductase, oh my God, cholesterol, the whole routine. And we become
And
very, very
structure-based
molecular.
design
Pardon?
and structure-based drug design.
And
That was a
structure-based
big
drug
one for
design,
Vertex.
every atom counts. And I think we now have both the product modalities, but also the analytical tools to really go back and think about systems. And physiology is what I mean by systems, right? So the complicated diseases that we have to address are probably system problems. I mean,
Right.
how many single target neurodegenerative drugs have we tried in the clinic and found we're nibbling at the corners? And so we need to look more holistically at some of these more complicated problems, and I like infectious disease because you can look at the whole organism,
Yeah.
but nobody wants to fund infectious disease. That's a different story. But I think the lesson there is studying studying integrative processes, building tools, some of them digital tools, to allow you to look accurately at integrative processes will be necessary to open the doors to some of these more complicated diseases, starting with immune regulation or neurodegeneration or whatever. So I'm kind of looking at that and asking who's not afraid of the complexity, who's
Yeah.
sensible enough to design things that can be a flashlight in the complexity.
I love that. I love that. Well, we're nearing the end, but Vicki, you have been so successful beyond measure across so
Thank
many different areas. But I would
you.
love to ask you, it's a question from our audience member, Alex. How do you personally define success? And how has that evolved throughout your career?
Um, you know, I think I grew up, and maybe this is an Asian thing too. I grew up with the sometimes spoken but usually unspoken mandate: don't do anything to embarrass your family. Make your family proud. Make sure you contribute to
Yeah,
the. We would never use the word brand, but make sure you contribute to the honor of the family.
yeah,
So for a long time, success for me was to be for my parents to be proud of what I did, for the community, for the not to be an embarrassment to the Japanese American community, whatever. These were important markers of success and still are. Their values now that are very important to me. I think success now though is more um, about two things. One is about learning. I'm kind of a hog for learning. And I learned so much about policy that I never thought I even wanted to learn by sitting on this government thing. Um, and impact just is the time you're spending working hard going to translate into something that matters? And by matters, I mean you can use your own whatever your assay is. If your assay is will it make money? Fine, that's great. Are you working on something that's going to make money? If your assay is some disease, great. Are you actually working on something that's going to make a measurable difference in how that disease is treated, or are you going to be a rounding error on results that we already have? So I think it's so for me more and more, it's how much can I learn in the time I've got left? And how can I translate that learning into those lessons into something that continues to have impact for other people?
That so resonates with me, and you've had impact on so many people. And I do want to close with, I don't know if you know, I'm very close friends from college and grad school with Jeff Tong, who is now a partner at Third Rock.
Yeah.
But you were on his board when he was chief business officer at Infinity. And I just want to close with something he wrote to me. He just felt so moved to write to me about you. He said, Vicky's voice was always held in the highest respect, and I loved seeing that. And in a reassuring way, I felt like I belonged, even though for the entire decade I was at Infinity, I was the only Asian American member of the executive leadership team. It was just for Jeff to reach out and to say that to me, I've known him for so long. I just had to share that with you, the impact you've had broadly across the community. So with that, I mean,
Thank
I could talk to you for hours and I'd love to. So hopefully in the future we can do that. But I want to thank you so much for joining us, Vicki. And I want to thank everyone who joined us. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our site, elevatebiotech.org. Feel free to LinkedIn post it once we do post it, and continue to follow us to learn about future events. So
Thank
thank
you so much. Thank you so much for having me again. It's been a treat. I look forward to more bidirectional conversations. And Angie, I'm so glad ElevAAte brought us together.
I know, me too,
And
me
a
too. And
kiss to you,
someday we're
Jeff.
meeting in person, Vicki. Take care. Bye, everyone. Thank you.